All right, Mr. Love here. Today we want to talk about what citizenship looks like in the United States compared to what citizenship looks like in other countries around the world. And we're going to focus our conversation, specifically on the rights preserved by the different constitutions of the countries. Now, just a quick review. A constitution, all that is just a written framework for government. Our constitution is nothing really radical. It wasn't a brand new idea. Countries have had constitutions for all throughout history. Now, the thing about ours is the longest standing constitution in history. And so we have done a few things right. So we're going to go through these same countries that you guys are going to be looking at in your activities in this lesson together, and do a little bit of comparing of those rights preserved by the constitutions. The first country that we want to look at is the country of India. This is located in Asia, has about 1.1 billion people living in it. Compared to the United States, we have about 320 million. So it's close to 4 times the population of the United States, and has one of the longest constitutions in the modern world. And much like the United States, it lays out specific rights of the individual people. So when you look at freedom of speech, for the United States, it says that our Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, right? Our First Amendment also lays out freedom of the press. India's constitution does not lay out freedom of the press. Instead, their freedom of speech clause does kind of double duty there, covering for that as well. But India's constitution says that all citizens should have the right to a freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So we're very similar when it comes to freedom of speech. Again, we already mentioned with freedom of the press that India's constitution doesn't necessarily lay that out. Our First Amendment gives us rights to religion, assembly, speech, press, and petition. Okay? In terms of freedom of religion, we have what's known as the Establishment Clause in our First Amendment, which says that our Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, which is a state-sanctioned religion. We're not going to approve of one religion over another. India's constitution says, subject to the public order and moral health, all persons are equally entitled to the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. All right, so they have a very similar freedom of religion as well. It's just worded slightly differently. Now, the interesting tidbit, the interesting difference here for India, all right, I want you guys to listen to what our Constitution says. Our Constitution says that the people have the right to rule, right? Popular sovereignty, that ideal. We are the ones who give up our rights, and the government has the power for that. And we do our best to preserve the rights of the individual, and we do our best to preserve the rights of the state. But listen to this quote from India's constitution, pretty interesting. It says, it shall be the duty of every citizen in India to strive towards excellence in all spheres of individual and collective activity so that the nation consistently rises to a higher level of endeavor and achievement, right? So people should better themselves for the betterment of the nation, is what they're saying, and that the nation should be the one who is, for lack of a better term, glorified rather than the individual. So that's an interesting shift between the thinking in the Indian Constitution and the thinking in the United States Constitution. But again, if you're looking at one of the most populous countries in the world, their rights are very, very, very similar to that of the United States, so not too terribly different. The next country we want to talk about is Germany. Germany is interesting. It's made up of a lot of different states, kind of like the United States is. It has a constitution, just like the United States, and it has a female leader, which is something that we have yet to do. But just to make a long story short, and you'll read about this a little bit more, in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and equality under the law, Germany and the United States are very, very similar. No real deviation between the two. But the interesting little caveat, Germany's constitution says, and I'll read it for you, men and women shall have equal rights. The state shall promote the actual implementation of equal rights for women and men and take steps to eliminate disadvantages that now exist. Our Constitution says nothing about men. You know, the Declaration of Independence said that all, or excuse me, nothing about women. The Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, right? So it's an interesting look here, should the United States amend our Constitution to include the word women so that it's very straightforward as to what it's saying? Or should we continue the way that we are? So it's interesting that countries, when they create their constitutions, they want to be very careful about the wording of those constitutions to make sure that they're getting across everything they want to get across. So, for example, equality under law, Germany wants to be very specific that men and women are created equal in that sense. Moving over to South America, Brazil has had a great year so far. They'll have a great 2016 when they host the Olympics as well, but they just finished up hosting the World Cup. Sadly, Argentina, who I was rooting for, didn't win. They were offsides on the one goal, but I digress. All right, so again, long story short, compared in freedom of speech, press, religion, and equality under the law, we've gone from Asia to Germany. We already know about North America in our country to South America. Again, very, very similar, but an interesting caveat with Brazil. And again, should the United States move towards something like this, right? Voting. Voting is a civic responsibility, right? How do you remember the difference? I don't know if I've said this, but this is a little mnemonic I like to use. My students think it's funny, but you won't forget it, all right? How do you tell the difference between a civic responsibility and a civic duty? All right, you have to do your duty. Go ahead, laugh, right? You don't go to the bathroom to do a responsibility, if you know what I'm saying. So a duty is something that you have to do, like you have to go to jury duty, you have to pay your taxes. Those are civic duties, right? If you don't do them, somebody's going to come after you, you're going to get in trouble for it. A responsibility, however, is something that you don't necessarily have to do. For example, voting. If you choose not to vote, nobody's going to come and throw you into jail for that, right? That's your right to exercise to vote or to not vote. Now, I would highly encourage you in every single election that you can get out there and vote. It's great. All right, but in Brazil's constitution, I'll read this to you too. There's an interesting little caveat. All right, electoral enrollment, voting, and voting are mandatory for persons over 18 years of age, and optional for the illiterate, people who can't read, those over 70 years of age, and those over 16 but under 18 years old, right? And the United States Constitution says that our voting will not be abridged, meaning that you can or you cannot. We're just not going to put any hindrances in places to keep people from being able to do that. We abolished poll taxes. We've granted the right to vote to women, African Americans, etc. So it's interesting to think about, too, that little caveat in their Constitution. Should the United States move to say something like that and make voting mandatory, or do we want to leave it being a civic responsibility? So we've talked about Asia, Europe, North America, South America. We're going to move to the Middle East and talk about the country of Iran. Now, Iran, a little bit different. Let's look at their constitution and save all the political talk for another time, all right? So in terms of freedom of speech, Iran's constitution says nothing about individual people having a freedom of speech. They do have a freedom of the press, and that has to serve sort of double duty within their constitution. So there's no protected freedom of speech. If you look at the freedom of religion, the United States Constitution says that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. Iran's constitution, in their constitution, their legal framework for government, it says the official religion of Iran is Islam, and the principle will remain eternally immutable, meaning can't change it. So that's something very interesting too. You have to adhere to practice of Islam in Iran. So let's see here. In terms of equality under the law, Iran's constitution says all citizens of the country, both men and women, equally enjoy the protection of the law. Okay, that doesn't mean that they have necessarily the same equal rights under their religious beliefs, but in terms of the law, they're going to be treated as the same. So that's something very interesting. And so the last little caveat of Iran's constitution is this. I'll read it to you. It says, the preservation of the environment is regarded as a public duty for the Islamic Republic. Let's see here. Pollution of the environment can cause irreparable damage to it and is therefore forbidden. Excuse me. So Iran's constitution takes into consideration the environment. Should the United States Constitution do that? Is that something that we need to make sure that we enforce or have a framework for government. Yes, we already have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal agency that looks after that. Since Theodore Roosevelt, we've created some of the most beautiful national parks in the world. But should we put that in our Constitution? So there's an interesting caveat that Iran includes. But again, the rights in Iran are much, much different than that of the United States. And so citizenship there is going to look a lot different than what the United States looks like. So hopefully through this video and through the activities that you guys are doing in this lesson, you'll have a better perspective and a better understanding of what citizenship looks like in different countries. Now, as you go through your reading, look for some other little caveats. There's some other little interesting things that you can and cannot do in these other countries, and how freedom of religion, assembly, speech, press, petition, etc. are protected in one country and maybe not so much in another country. So use that information, look at what citizenship looks like across the entire world. I hope you guys have a great day.